In late 1983, Radio Shack unveiled a computer that, on paper, beat IBM at its own game. The Tandy 2000, powered by an 8 MHz Intel 8186, could outrun IBM's brand new PCXT and even edge out the 6 MHz PCAT that IBM hadn't quite finished yet. It pushed more pixels, stored more data, and in benchmark after benchmark, it was the faster, sleeker machine. And yet, 4 decades later, the Tandy 2000 is remembered, if it's remembered at all, as a historical curiosity, a dead end, a powerful system that never quite belonged to the world it was born into. Its story is a paradox. A computer designed to be better than IBM's standard in almost every technical respect, that ended up proving just how little better matters when you break compatibility with the standard itself. This is the rise and fall of the Tandy 2000, a machine that was, as one commentator later put it, twice as good as its successor, and not even half as successful. To understand why Tandy built the 2000 the way it did, you have to wind back to the late 1970s. In August 1977, Radio Shack's TRS-80 Model 1 helped kick off the personal computer boom, landing in stores the same year as the Apple II and Commodore PET. It was a Zilog Z80-based machine running its own operating system and software, sold through thousands of Radio Shack outlets across the United States. For many Americans, the first computer they ever saw in person sat on a Radio Shack counter, humming away under fluorescent lights. 2 years later, in October 1979, Tandy pushed upmarket with the TRS-80 Model 2, a more serious business computer. Over the next few years, the family tree branched. The Model 3 and then the Model 4 took over the consumer and education niches, while the Model 12 and 16 added a Motorola 68000 option and aimed squarely at offices. All of these systems had one thing in common. They lived in their own world. Proprietary operating systems, proprietary software, and a retail chain that refused to stock third-party products. If you bought a Tandy computer, you bought Tandy software and Tandy peripherals from a Tandy store. That worked, right up until 1981, when IBM walked into the room and quietly rearranged the furniture. In August 1981, IBM introduced the Model 5150 personal computer. It wasn't the first microcomputer, or even the most advanced, but it had IBM's name on the front, used off-the-shelf components, and ran a new operating system from a small company called Microsoft. Within 2 years, the IBM PC had become something the industry had never really seen before, a de facto standard. Its BIOS was straightforward enough to clone, its bus slots open enough to populate, and its software library big enough that customers began to expect IBM-compatible logos on everything they bought. Tandy watched its hard-won market share ebb away. By 1983, the company's refusal to sell third-party software and add-ons, once a tidy way to keep margins in-house, was now a liability. Customers wanted Lotus 123, WordStar, DBase, and the rest of the IBM software universe. They wanted to know their hardware would run what the office down the hall was running. Tandy wasn't alone in scrambling for a response. Across the Atlantic, Olivetti built the M24, later sold in the U.S. as the AT&T 6300. Zenith Data Systems offered the Z100. All of them were, in one form or another, attempts to pivot into the world the IBM PC had created, a world where success meant speaking IBM's language. Inside Tandy, the conclusion was clear. The next machine had to run MS-DOS. It had to court IBM's software. And somehow, it had to be more interesting than a beige PC clone. The project that became the Tandy 2000 began with what sounded like a sensible premise: build an IBM-style computer that was simply better. Instead of the now familiar Intel 8088 at 4.77 MHz, Tandy's engineers chose the newer 8186, clocked at 8 MHz. It was a full 16-bit processor with a 16-bit data bus and more efficient instruction decoding. In practice, the Tandy 2000 could run many tasks roughly twice as fast as an IBM PC or XT, and at least slightly faster than IBM's forthcoming 6 MHz PCAT. On raw throughput, it was ahead of its time. The rest of the design followed the same philosophy. Memory started at 128 kilobytes, and, with the right configuration, could climb to 768 kilobytes under its customized MS-DOS 2.11. well past the 640 kilobyte ceiling that IBM's architecture would become famous for. Its 5.25-inch floppy drives used 80-track, double-sided so-called quad-density disks, storing 720 kilobytes apiece instead of the IBM standard 360. Graphics were another leap. Optional boards offered 640 by 400 pixel displays, either monochrome with an intensity bit or in 8 colors, selected from a palette of 16. Compared to the blocky 320 by 200 4-color CGA graphics common on IBM machines, the Tandy 2000 looked distinctly high-resolution and businesslike. Even expansion followed this do-it-right logic. Rather than copy IBM's 8-bit ISA bus, Tandy designed a 96-pin proprietary bus for 4 internal cards, tailored to the 16-bit CPU. On paper, this was exactly what management had asked for, an IBM-style MS-DOS machine that was faster, higher capacity, and more capable than the standard it chased. The Tandy 2000's public debut came on November 28, 1983 at the COMDEX Fall Trade Show in Las Vegas. On the show floor, Radio Shack showed 2 main configurations. The base Tandy 2000 with 2 5.25-inch quad-density floppies and 128 kilobytes of RAM carried an official introductory price around $2,750, plus extra for a monitor. A hard disk model, the 2000 HD, with a 10 megabyte drive and 256 kilobytes of RAM, listed at about $4,250. Some contemporary reports and later retrospectives cite a simplified $2,999 figure for a typical system. Exact pricing varied slightly by configuration and source. The case itself told a story. On the front panel, nestled side by side, were 2 logos, TRS-80 and Tandy. It was the only machine Radio Shack ever sold that carried both names, and it marked the beginning of the end for the TRS-80 brand. From here on out, future models would be simply Tandy computers. The press reaction was, at first, enthusiastic. Here was a fast MS-DOS machine that appeared to leapfrog IBM's PC-XT, and early reviews noted that in many tasks, it could even outpace the not-yet-released AT. For a company better known for hobbyist systems and retail gadgetry, Tandy suddenly looked like a serious contender in the new MS-DOS world. If the hardware made the Tandy 2000 impressive, the software pitch made it look visionary. Tandy struck a close partnership with Microsoft. Bill Gates himself appeared in Radio Shack marketing materials, seated in front of a Tandy 2000 running an early graphical environment, a pre-release build of Microsoft Windows. In 1984, this was a bold image. Apple's Macintosh had not yet shipped. IBM was still years away from Windows becoming central to its own PC strategy. Yet here was a mainstream retailer suggesting that ordinary business users could soon be clicking through windows and icons on an affordable 16-bit machine. The choice of Windows wasn't accidental. Because Windows relied on device drivers, it offered a way to paper over the hardware differences between the Tandy 2000 and a true IBM PC. If users lived inside Windows applications, the underlying quirks of the 8186 and Tandy's graphics wouldn't matter as much. The problem was timing. Tandy's 2000 hit the market in late 1983. Those glossy ads with Bill Gates ran in 1984. But Microsoft Windows 1.0 didn't actually ship until November 1985, almost 2 years after the computer's release. By the time Windows finally reached store shelves, the Tandy 2000's moment had passed, and IBM-compatible machines had raced ahead. What was meant to be Tandy's great differentiator instead became an awkward reminder of promises the market didn't get to keep in time. Beneath the benchmarks and the marketing, the Tandy 2000 had a problem that would prove fatal. It was only IBM-compatible in a narrow theoretical sense. On paper, it ran MS-DOS and implemented the same BIOS calls as IBM's PC and XT. Well-behaved text mode applications that relied strictly on DOS and BIOS services often worked. But much of the era's most popular software did not behave that politely. Performance-hungry programs, especially games, graphics packages, and some business software, often bypassed DOS and the BIOS, talking directly to the hardware for speed. That meant assuming IBM's specific hardware layout, the addresses of timers, interrupt controllers, display adapters, and so on. Here, the Tandy 2000 diverged. The Intel 8186 integrated several of those peripheral functions directly into the CPU, but not at the same I/O addresses IBM's discrete chips used. That design made the Tandy simpler and faster, but it also meant that any software written with IBM's hardware map in mind would fail or at best misbehave on a Tandy 2000. The expansion bus compounded the issue. Instead of adopting IBM's ISA slots, Tandy's 96-pin proprietary bus demanded custom cards. Tandy produced its own selection of expansion options, but third-party vendors, already busy serving the booming IBM ecosystem, hesitated to invest in a separate line for a single machine. In theory, you had a powerful MS-DOS computer. In practice, you had a system that could only run the subset of well-behaved software, plus whatever the market was willing to specially port. Initially, Tandy tried to bridge the gap the old-fashioned way, by lining up custom versions of key programs. Drawing on its experience in the CP/M era, when different machines often needed slightly different builds, Tandy worked with software publishers to produce Tandy 2000 editions of major packages. Within months of launch, many of the productivity titles a mid-1980s office might want were available in 2000-specific versions, at least by special order through Radio Shack stores. For a while, that helped. An accountant could still get a spreadsheet. A writer could still get a word processor. But the edges of the software universe were fraying. New releases often reached the IBM PC first, with Tandy versions following later, if at all. Buyers who wanted assurance that any new hit program would just work increasingly gravitated to more literal IBM clones. Meanwhile, the hardware ecosystem never really blossomed. Tandy's proprietary expansion cards covered basics like additional memory, communications, and hard disks. But the broad experimental add-on culture that formed around ISA slots simply passed the Tandy 2000 by. By 1985, as cheaper and more compatible clones flooded the market, the 2000's combination of high performance and limited compatibility looked less like a clever compromise and more like an awkward middle ground. As the 1980s wore on, the Tandy 2000 quietly slid down the company's priority list. The machine remained on the books until around 1988, but its role in Tandy's public lineup diminished rapidly after the mid-decade pivot to more IBM-compatible designs. Marketing energy shifted elsewhere. Development of new 2000-specific software slowed. Inside Radio Shack, the company found a use for the hardware it had on hand. Unsold Tandy 2000 units were repurposed as in-store terminals, an echo of an earlier backup plan once considered for the original TRS-80 Model 1. Instead of front-office status symbols, they became the beige boxes clerks used behind the counter. Some technical complaints followed the 2000 through its short commercial life. Its high-capacity floppy drives, for instance, earned a reputation in some circles for being finicky, though reports about the root cause vary and are not entirely consistent in the historical record. But these were footnotes next to the larger issue. No matter how well it worked when it did work, it was increasingly out of step with what buyers now expected from an MS-DOS machine. By the time production ceased, the Tandy 2000 had gone from ambitious IBM rival to an internal workhorse, remembered by most customers, if at all, as that fast Tandy that wouldn't run everything. Tandy's real escape route from the compatibility trap arrived surprisingly quickly. In 1984, roughly a year after the 2000's debut, the company introduced the Tandy 1000 line. Where the 2000 had tried to be a forward-looking, quasi-compatible high-end system, the 1000 was deliberately grounded in the existing IBM landscape. Built around more conventional 8088 and 8086 processors, the Tandy 1000s were designed to be broadly compatible with IBM's own PCs, and in particular with the PC Junior's enhanced graphics and sound. They kept enough of Tandy's own flavor, better audio, consumer-friendly packaging, to stand out on Radio Shack shelves, but did so without straying too far from the de facto standard. Ironically, in at least one way, the 2000's influence lived on. The keyboard layout Tandy introduced with the 2000 and carried into early 1000 models put the function keys in a row along the top and grouped the arrow keys in an inverted T. At a time when IBM still kept its function keys down the left side, this arrangement was unusual. Within a few years, it had become the industry norm for desktop keyboards. Commercially, the Tandy 1000 line fared far better than the 2000 ever did, anchoring Radio Shack's PC business for the rest of the decade. The lesson was hard to miss. Compatibility first, clever engineering second. Today, the Tandy 2000 survives mostly in museums, collectors' rooms, and the memories of people who used one when it was new. From a technical standpoint, it remains an intriguing what-if. A machine that anticipated higher resolution graphics, larger floppies, and more memory years before those features became standard across the IBM PC world. Its choice of the 8186, while disastrous for strict compatibility, foreshadowed the industry's broader move to faster, more integrated processors. Its real legacy, though, is more cautionary than celebratory. The 2000 showed in concrete, expensive detail that in a platform market dominated by a single standard, being better in isolation isn't enough. The network of software, peripherals, and user expectations around IBM's architecture proved more powerful than any individual machine's spec sheet. Tandy itself absorbed that lesson. The company's later, more compatible systems leaned heavily into IBM-style designs, even as they tried to offer their own twists. But the cautiousness that set in after the 2000s failure arguably dulled some of the company's willingness to take risks in the 1990s, just as the PC market consolidated around larger players. Looking back from the present, the story feels familiar. New phones, consoles, and operating systems still rise and fall not just on what they can do, but on whether they fit into the ecosystems people already depend on. The Tandy 2000 was fast, ambitious, and in some ways ahead of its time. It lost anyway, because the world had already decided what a PC was. In the end, its greatest contribution may be the reminder that in technology, as in language, you can't redefine the standard on your own, no matter how eloquent your hardware might be.